Chapter 9 Parliament and Protests. The End of Salutatory Neglect. The French and Indian War had been very expensive, so Great Britain had a large debt. In addition, the expanding British territory meant that indigenous peoples were forced off their land by violence and deceptive treaties. England sent a standing army to America to protect the colonists from indigenous resistance, and those troops had to be paid too. In order to pay off the war debt and maintain the standing army England had sent to America to protect the colonists, Parliament raised taxes. Standing army, a professional army maintained even in peacetime. The Sugar Act. The Sugar Act of 1764 actually lowered taxes on molasses that were brought into the colonies in the hope that they would minimize smuggling. Because customs officers were trying to stop smugglers, they searched ships and any suspected contraband could be taken away, even before the smuggler was convicted. Colonists believed that the Sugar Act violated their legal rights as British citizens by denying the right to a trial. And some went even further. James Otis, a lawyer in Boston, argued that Parliament did not have the right to tax the colonists at all, since the colonists did not have representatives there to debate the tax. The Stamp Act. In 1765, the Stamp Act was passed. Any printed paper goods, including legal documents, had to be taxed and have a stamp proving the tax was paid. The Stamp Act was the first direct tax on individual colonists. Protests broke out, including boycotts, in which colonists refused to purchase British goods at all. Boycott, a protest in which people don't purchase controversial items. Stamp agents were tarred and feathered, and mobs prevented stamp distributions. That October, representatives from 9 colonies met in New York for the Stamp Act Congress. They wrote a petition explaining how the Stamp Act was a violation of their natural and political rights. In March of 1766, at the urging of British merchants who had been hurt by the boycotts, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. But on the same day, they issued the Declaratory Act, which basically reasserted Parliament's power to tax as it pleased. Repeal, to undo a law. Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry. Boston businessman Samuel Adams agreed with Otis. He summed up Otis's position at the Boston town meeting in 1764 as no taxation without representation. It became a rallying cry. Adams was a co-founder of a secret society called the Sons of Liberty, which organized boycotts and protests, some of them violent. Women formed the Daughters of Liberty, urging Americans to use homemade, rather than imported, clothes and household goods. This was some of the first political involvement by women in America. Patrick Henry was a lawyer and a member of the House of Burgesses. In 1765, he raised the cry of no taxation without representation in Virginia and inspired the Burgesses to protest the Stamp Act. Some believed that these protests were headed toward treason. Henry said, "If this be treason, make the most of it," and implied overthrowing the king. Treason, a crime against a government to which one should be loyal. The Townshend Acts. Parliament still wanted to raise more money to pay for British troops in America and the expenses of the French and Indian War. In 1767, it passed the Townshend Acts, which taxed imports, including tea. Colonists were infuriated by another tax being passed without their permission. They were also angry about the writs of assistance, which gave customs officials permission to search for taxable goods without a search warrant. Soon, tax collectors were among the most unpopular people in North America, and many went home to England to escape threats on their lives. The the royal governor of Massachusetts asked England to send soldiers to maintain peace and enforce the law. The Boston Massacre. In 1768, 1,000 redcoats came to Boston. To the colonists, the redcoats were not there to help, but were occupying troops. On March 5th, 1770, a minor dispute broke out between a soldier and some Bostonians who threw snowballs at him. More soldiers and more citizens came on the scene, and a mob formed. In front of the customs house, where the taxes were collected, stones were thrown, and some citizens dared the soldiers to fire. A few soldiers panicked and did, killing 5 Boston citizens. The event came to be known as the Boston Massacre. The 5 victims became heroes of the colonial cause, notably Crispus Attucks, son of African and Wampanoag parents. Lawyer John Adams, a cousin of Samuel Adams, argued that everyone, including the soldiers, were entitled to a fair trial. He and Josiah Quincy defended the soldiers, who were freed on the grounds of self-defense. The trial demonstrated to the world that the colonists were committed to justice. Boston Tea Party. Parliament repealed all of the Townshend Acts in 1770 except one, the tax on tea. People in Massachusetts were able to purchase smuggled tea. However, in 1773, when the British East India Company faced financial ruin, Parliament passed the New Tea Act, giving the company a monopoly on selling tea directly to the colonists and making taxed tea cheaper than smuggled tea. That reinforced taxes on the colonies and hurt local merchants who had made their living from tea. Monopoly, a situation in which one company has complete control of an entire market. Many colonists began to drink coffee to replace tea. At midnight on the night of December 16, 1773, while 3 East India Company's ships were docked in Boston, the Sons of Liberty, disguised as indigenous people, boarded the ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. This was dubbed the Boston Tea Party. Because they considered themselves loyal British citizens, the colonists attempted to pay England back for the tea in exchange for a repeal of the Tea Act. However, the King and Parliament had finally had enough and were determined to punish the colony of Massachusetts. The Intolerable Acts. King George III acknowledged that England would either need to master the colonists or leave them to themselves. He picked master. In 1774, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, known as in the colonies the Intolerable Acts, because Boston Harbor was closed until colonists compensated the East India Company for its lost tea. Most town meetings were banned. The Charter of Massachusetts was revoked. The Massachusetts legislature was put under control of the new governor, General Thomas Gage. In effect, Boston was put under martial law. Royal officials who committed crimes in the colonies couldn't be tried in colonial courts. The Quartering Act forced colonists to let British soldiers stay in their homes. Land the colonists thought belonged to them had been given to Quebec, the Quebec Act. The goal was to exert control in the colonies, but the Intolerable Acts had the opposite effect.